The summer of 1892 settled over the frontier like a heavy, endless blanket. The sun scorched the plains until the ground cracked and the air shimmered with heat. Dust rose with every hoofbeat and hung there golden in the light, clinging to a man's throat until he felt like he'd swallowed half the desert. Out along the wagon road that wound through the dry grass, a lone drifter rode slow. His name was James Calder, a man who had seen more miles than most folks saw years. His hat brim was bent low, his shirt patched and sun-faded, and his eyes carried the weight of a man who had lost too much but still kept moving forward. He had no place to be and nowhere to call home, only the road stretching out before him. It was near a dry creek bed where he found her. At first, he thought it was nothing more than a heap of rags abandoned in the dust. But as his horse drew closer, he saw the truth. A woman lay there, collapsed against the baked earth, her dress torn, her bonnet tossed aside. Her shoulders shook with silent sobs, her hands pressed against her face. She didn't hear him at first, didn't hear the steady step of his horse or the creak of leather as he swung down. She was lost somewhere deep inside herself, her grief spilling into the dust like water into sand. James crouched near her, his boots scuffing the dirt. For a moment, he didn't say a word. Sometimes words only made things worse. When she finally lowered her hands, he saw her face. The tracks of her tears were streaked with dirt, her lips cracked, her eyes raw with exhaustion. She looked up at him as though half afraid he was another ghost come to haunt her. Her voice broke when she tried to speak. "Please, don't send me back." The drifter's chest tightened. He didn't yet know where she'd come from or who had driven her into this wilderness, but he knew one thing clear enough: no one should be left crying in the dust like this. He reached out, his hand rough but gentle, and lifted her chin. Her eyes met his, and for the first time she stopped shaking. "You're not alone now," James said quietly, the heat of the sun beating down around them. "Not while I'm here." The wind stirred the grass, carrying with it the silence of the plains, as if the whole world had paused to hear that promise. The woman didn't answer right away. Her lips trembled as though words were caught inside her but too heavy to lift out. James didn't press her. He'd seen enough broken souls to know that silence was sometimes the only thing keeping them together. He glanced at her hands. They were raw, scraped across the palms, as if she'd been dragged or stumbling for miles. Her dress was torn at the hem, snagged by brush, and one shoe was missing altogether. Whoever she was, she hadn't just wandered out here. She'd been driven. "Can you stand?" James asked after a moment, his voice steady. She shook her head faintly. Her hair fell across her face, tangled and streaked with dust. He slid his arms beneath her, lifting her as if she weighed no more than a child. She gasped at the sudden motion, then clung to his shirt, her fingers bunching into the fabric as if afraid he might set her down and leave her. "You're safe now," James murmured, though the words felt fragile against the empty land. He carried her to his horse, a broad-shouldered bay that flicked its ears back at the sudden weight. James shifted her carefully into the saddle, then swung up behind her, steadying her with an arm across her waist. They rode slow, the sun dropping lower, painting the plains in long shadows. For miles she said nothing, only leaned against him as if every ounce of strength had drained from her. James didn't mind the silence. He'd grown used to the long stretches of it, with only his horse for company. At last, when the horizon burned orange, she spoke. Her voice was soft, cracked from thirst, but every word held the weight of survival. "My name is Clara." James nodded. "James Calder," he replied. Clara's fingers tightened around his sleeve. "They left me there," she whispered, almost to herself. "Said if I wanted to follow I had to keep up, but when I fell—" Her words faltered. "They didn't look back." James felt a slow burn rise in his chest, not from the heat of the sun, but from the anger curling tight in his gut. He didn't ask who "they" were. Not yet. He only pulled her a little closer, as though shielding her from the memory. "You're with me now," he said. "That's what matters." By the time they reached the small rise where James often camped, night had begun to spill across the sky. He built a fire quickly, sparks rising into the dark, and gave her water from his canteen. She drank like someone who had forgotten what water tasted like. When the flames caught steady, she sat close to them, her shoulders drawn in, watching the fire as though afraid it might vanish too. James sat across from her, silent but steady, the way he always was when tending to a wounded creature. Clara's voice was so faint he almost missed it. "Why did you stop for me?" James studied her across the fire, his face hidden half in shadow. Finally, he said, "Because no one deserves to be left in the dust." The fire popped, and for the first time, Clara's eyes softened with something more than fear, something that looked almost like hope. The night deepened, carrying with it the mournful call of coyotes in the distance. Clara sat rigid by the fire, her knees pulled close to her chest, the firelight painting her face in shifting shades of gold and shadow. James poured hot water over dried coffee grounds, the bitter scent drifting between them. He didn't push her, but silence only lasts so long before it demands to be broken. "They weren't strangers," she said suddenly, her voice sharp against the stillness. "They were supposed to be my family." James froze, his hand halfway to two. "He pot." "My uncle," Clara continued, her words trembling, "and the men he rides with. When my father died, he promised he'd look after me, said blood was stronger than anything. But when things got hard, when food grew scarce and the cattle started dying, he decided I was just another mouth to feed, another weight slowing them down." James set the pot down gently, his jaw tightening. "They told me to keep up. They rode ahead and never looked back." Her voice cracked like brittle wood. "When I stumbled, when I called out, nothing, just dust. They didn't care if I lived or died. Maybe they hoped I wouldn't." The flames spit sparks into the night, and James studied her quietly. He'd known men like that, selfish, cruel in the name of survival. He'd seen them leave behind the old, the weak, the unwanted. But hearing it from her lips made his chest ache with a weight he hadn't expected. "You're not a burden," James said finally. His voice was low, steady, carrying more certainty than Clara had ever heard from a man before. "Not to me." Clara's eyes flicked up at him, startled. For a heartbeat she looked as though she might argue, but instead her gaze faltered, softening into something uncertain, like she wanted to believe him, but didn't know how. James shifted his weight, leaning forward. "I'll tell you something I've learned out here, the kind of men who leave others in the dust. They're the weak ones. Takes more strength to carry someone than to cast them aside." Her throat worked as she swallowed, fighting tears that burned against her eyes. She pressed a hand to her mouth as if to keep them from spilling, but James didn't look away. He let her cry, let her shoulders shake in the glow of the fire, because he knew some wounds had to be bled out before they could heal. When she finally spoke again, her voice was almost too small to hear. "Why do you care?" James stirred the fire with a stick, the flames crackling higher. He thought for a moment before answering. "Because once, someone cared enough to stop for me. If they hadn't..." He glanced toward the dark horizon, his expression unreadable. "I wouldn't be here." The fire popped again, and Clara's hand slowly dropped from her mouth. She studied him, this drifter who carried his past like a shadow at his heels. She didn't know his whole story, but she knew in that moment that he understood hers in a way no one else ever had. For the first time since he'd found her in the dust, she whispered the words she hadn't dared to say aloud. "Thank you, James." He tipped his hat slightly, not to dismiss her, but to acknowledge the weight of her gratitude. "You don't owe me thanks," he said. "You just owe yourself a chance." The firelight caught her face, and though the tears still lingered, something in her eyes flickered back to life. The fire burned low, the logs collapsing into glowing embers, but Clara didn't feel the same gnawing cold that had haunted her all evening. James had shifted closer, not crowding her, but enough that the warmth of his presence carried across the thin space between them. For the first time in days, her hands stopped trembling. But peace in the wilderness was never more than a fragile thread, ready to snap. James's head lifted suddenly, his eyes narrowing toward the canyon rim. The easy calm in his face was gone, replaced by the sharp stillness of a man listening for danger. Clara froze, following his gaze, but saw only darkness. "What is it?" she whispered. He raised a hand, steady and quiet, signaling her to hold her tongue. The night air was thick, carrying only the wind's low whistle across the rocks. Then, faint but undeniable, the crunch of hooves on dry earth. More than one horse. Clara's breath caught. "They found me," she whispered, the words tasting of fear. James's jaw tightened. He pushed himself to his feet in one smooth motion and reached for the rifle leaning against a stone. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice quiet but fohy. The kind of voice that left no room for argument. Clara stood slowly, her legs shaky, clutching the blanket tight around her shoulders. Her eyes darted to the fire, to the trail, to James, like a trapped bird searching for escape. The riders came into view moments later, their silhouettes black against the pale wash of starlight. 3 men, mounted and armed, scanning the ground. One of them leaned forward in his saddle, pointing toward the glow of the fire. James's fingers tightened around the rifle. The lead rider called out, his voice harsh and cruelly familiar to Clara. "Girl, you there? You think you can run from blood?" Clara's knees weakened. Her uncle's voice carried the same venom it had the night he turned his back on her. The sound alone pulled her straight back to that moment, to the helplessness, to the dust in her mouth as he left her behind. James moved a half step forward, putting his body squarely between her and the approaching men. He said nothing at first, letting the silence stretch. The crackle of the fire filled the space where words should have been. Finally, the silence between the two sides stretched long and thin, as if the night itself was holding its breath. James stood tall, rifle steady, his figure backlit by the faint glow of the fire. Clara could see how rigid his stance was, how every muscle seemed strung tight like a bowstring. Her uncle leaned in the saddle, spitting into the dust. "You're a fool," he growled. "Step aside. That girl belongs with us. She's blood." James didn't move. "Blood doesn't give you the right to break her," he said, his voice calm but cold enough to cut. One of the men beside her uncle shifted uncomfortably, muttering, "Maybe we just leave it, Hank. It's late. Ain't worth the trouble." Her uncle's head snapped toward the man, eyes blazing. "She's mine to decide for. You hear me? Mine." Clara's chest tightened. The old shame and fear surged inside her like floodwaters, threatening to pull her under. She took a half step back, clutching the blanket tighter around her shoulders. James sensed. Without taking his eyes off the riders, he spoke over his shoulder, his voice gentler. "Clara, don't let him make you small. Not tonight." The words hit her like a hand pulling her up from drowning. Her knees steadied. She blinked hard, lifting her chin. For once, she let herself believe him. Her uncle sneered. "Big talk from a drifter, but you don't know the girl like I do. She'll break, always does." James's answer was simple, but it landed like iron. "Not while I'm here." And then, everything broke at once. The other rider, spurred by her uncle's fury, jerked his pistol from its holster. The sound of the draw split the night. James's rifle came up in the same heartbeat, smooth and fast, his finger already tightening on the trigger. Clara gasped, frozen between them as the fire threw wild shadows across the canyon walls. "Don't!" James barked, his voice snapping sharp enough to stop a man cold. The muzzle of his rifle was fixed steady, unwavering. The gunman faltered, hesitating, his weapon half raised. Her uncle snarled, spurring his horse a step forward. "You don't scare me, Drifter. You think you can protect her? You'll be dead before morning." James didn't flinch. "Try me," he said. The fire cracked loud in the silence that followed, a burst of sparks leaping skyward like the night itself was siding with him. For the first time, Clara saw it. The doubt flick